because every individual has a preferred leadership style. Good leader actually knows how to practice multiple leadership behaviors based on the situation or context they find themselves in.
You know, when I was reading your bio before the show, I looked at, first of all, you have a literal entire alphabet of letters after your name, which is phenomenal, and we'll dive into that in a bit. But what really caught my attention was the amount of travel and experiences that you've done. To me, that was the most exciting part of that. Like Great Wall of China. There's, you know, so many different adventures and experiences. So I'd love to start there and figure out, like, what inspired you to go and do all of that travel? Was it something you always wanted to do, or was there like a thing that inspired, hey, let's go actually see the world?
We could definitely talk about that. I've had quite a few experiences. I've always wanted to, you know. My dad took me on. I remember I was probably 10, and my dad took me on a little mission trip to Mexico with our church group. And ever since then, I'm like, yeah, I could do this. And I remember thinking, I want to see other places and stuff. So, yeah, I've always wanted to travel.
Yeah. What part of travel do you find the most enjoyable? For me, it's like the ability to see so many different cultures. Yeah. And I think one of the coolest parts is finding out how much you have in common with them. Like, there may be a slight twist or variation to it, but there's so much human connection that's involved, like when you stop and actually witness it.
Yeah, people are people. And that's the thing that I've always stood out to me, is this idea of, you know, wherever you go, one, I like experiencing the nuance. I'm very interested in the nuance, the subtle differences. Like even when you go to a restaurant, just how it's different than what you have here. So, but then you're absolutely right. The people you meet are the most exciting part, and their stories and and then you realize, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, and those are the kinds of things that are so fun. Plus, I just like seeing new places. So, which is tons of fun for me.
Yeah. All right. So let's dive back to the earlier part of that. You've got a whole heck of a lot of accreditations. What's the inspiration for that? Was that like, let's see how far I can go? Like, looking at your bio, you've got so many different passions and pursuits. I'm curious, what inspired you to kind of follow all that?
Probably, if you ask my wife, she'd probably say ego. but no, the other, it's funny because, you know, I'm that guy who's the first person in their family, you know, to ever go to college, you know. So grandpa was a blue collar worker, dad was all uncles, all that kind of thing. And I actually, when I decided I wanted to go to college, I actually got, you know, grief from my uncles, you know, just for like, well, who do you think you are? You know, we just work in the car line, you know, kind of a thing. And that kind of lit a little fire there, you know, for one thing, to finish my education. But then once you get into it, what was fun for me is I just found that there's so many different things that I didn't know about that I'm interested in. So it was really just the pursuit of learning something new or different. And then and then I really am a sucker for seeing how unrelated disciplines actually relate together. And there's a word for it in academia. It's called the scholarship of integration, which is something I think is a lot of fun, of finding like interesting ideas from other disciplines and seeing how they apply to your discipline. And which is probably why I like traveling, is going around and seeing all the different people, different places. And like we mentioned, seeing how they're familiar and similar in certain ways. Right. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I've never actually thought about it, but yeah. But like I said, my wife would probably say, it's just your ego. You like seeing the law.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a lot to that. And I definitely feel much of the same way. Like, there's so much to learn. It's so cool to see as you learn these different dots that get connected together, and how everything is way more connected than we realize. We think that like things exist in silos.
Right.
But as you start to learn more, it's so evident that there's so much knowledge in this area which can be applied over here. What are some of your favorite examples that you've seen of that were like, holy crap, I can't believe this is connected to that?
Yeah. So, one of the things, even in I wrote a book called Contextual Intelligence, which is exactly about this particular issue of how often, for example, how leadership is a classic example. Everybody talks about leadership, but they realize that what one industry does applies to another industry. I actually started the whole idea with asking, my background is sports medicine. My first love is kind of sports medicine. So I spent a lot of time with the Olympic teams and different football teams and different things early in my career. And I've always wondered if this coach, who's a Super Bowl winning coach, an NBA championship coach, whatever, great coach, could they also be, or would they also be a great CEO of a company? If leadership is leadership, could they also do that? And that's really what started my my interest in all that. So I would start exploring at what are the different aspects of leadership that work everywhere. And there's actually not very many of them, because what we're finding, or what we found, is so many different industries have so much nuance within their industry that it's like, well, to lead effectively here, you need this skill set. To lead effectively there, you need that skill set. And that's really what got me thinking about all the different things. So I was, all right, well, I want to learn about this, and I want to learn about this, and I want to learn about this, because I want to find the common thing. What are the few things that do work everywhere? So in order to do that, you've got to spread the wealth, so to speak, and put your hands in a lot of different pots to actually live that out. And so that's kind of what I did. And my particular expertise or leadership is the leadership space.
So what do you think the commonalities are of a good leader in the different industries?
So one of the things,
what is it that you found?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The thing that is most important, regardless of industry, is their ability to diagnose the situation that they're in, and bring to light. Let me say it this way: it's their ability to demonstrate leadership differently depending on the context. Because one of the things that I found is absolutely, to me, it's hilarious, but it's just profoundly different. It's a difference between leadership and management. Most people in these leadership positions are actually just managing, and they're not leading. And what we're finding is it's actually the management in these different situations that's different, that's unique, right? If I'm going to manage the retail industry, I need these skills. If I'm going to manage a political environment, I need these skills. If I'm going to manage a nonprofit organization, I need these skills. And so it's management that really is different. But when we talk about leadership, all of a sudden we find, no, leadership is the same across the board. And so what you're really developing is individual management skills, not necessarily leadership skills. And we're starting to see a separation in that space. So the thing that is common in leadership is leaders know how to enter into a situation and know what leadership behaviors they need. The thing that I find so unique is every individual has a preferred leadership style, but they recognize that their preferred leadership style is very rarely the one that they need in this situation. So a skilled leader, a good leader, actually knows how to practice multiple leadership behaviors based on the situation or context they find themselves in. So.
That's interesting. I didn't actually think too much about the difference between leadership and management. I mean, obviously there are different topics, but when you talk about how most leaders, or what people would think of as a leader, are actually operating as managers, that's a pretty eye-opening statement. And I think if more people realized what role they were actually in and aligned their actions with that role, we'd have a much more seamless operation.
Yeah.
But is there ego or pride attached with that, where someone wants to call themselves a leader when they're really a manager?
Yes.
You think that's it?
So that's a great question. One, it's a cultural aspect for sure, because in our culture, we honor and respect leaders, right? So people just automatically assume, well, because I have a position or title of authority, director of sales, director of sports medicine, head athletic trainer, chief operating officer, these titles kind of imply, well, they must be a leader to get to that position. And really, organizations aren't designed to promote leaders. Organizations are designed to promote managers because of the metrics of success that organizations use as they are developing and promoting people. It's like, what do you get promoted for? You don't get promoted for being a good leader. You get promoted for reaching your quota, satisfying a set number, a metric, whatever the industry is, for achieving that metric. And you get promoted for that. You get promoted for performance, but you don't get promoted for leadership. In fact, most of the time, it's the leaders that get themselves in trouble in organizations. I believe it was John Maxwell who made kind of a famous quote years ago. He said, leading leaders is like herding cats. And that's so true, because in an organization, especially in a formal structure, the leaders are the ones that are the troublemakers. They're always pushing against the status quo. That's the number one. Well, I shouldn't say number one, because it's one of the top 5 characteristics of someone who demonstrates leadership, is they're always pushing against the status quo. And what that means for organizations is they're troublemakers. They're asking the questions. They're overturning the rocks. They're agitating the people around them because they see change as a real possibility. And most of the time, change is disruptive. People don't like change. They realize it has to happen, but they really don't like it. Leaders are always pushing for change. One of the things that is a big thing for me is, if I can tell a manager is a manager by their philosophy of life. And most of the time, if you live by the philosophy, or it's apparent that you're like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that's a manager's mindset. Whereas a leader's mindset is, we can always make this better. If it ain't broke, it's because we haven't messed with it enough, is more of a leader's mindset. And so leaders, like I said, they often get in trouble. And so, one of the big examples that I like to use is, think about sitting in a boardroom, and you're in a boardroom, you're in a team meeting, you're in a department meeting, whatever it is, there's people around the table or wherever you're meeting, and the manager or the designated leader is trying to facilitate this meeting. And there's generally 1 or 2 people in the room who everybody else in the room kind of look at out the corner of their eye to see how they're responding, in order to get the cue of how we should be responding. The managers, let's say they throw out this new idea. Hey, we've got this new quota program we're going to use, and we're going to start changing how we're, remunerating everybody. And this new bonus schedule system is how we got this thing here. And most people in the room are just sitting there taking. It's like, okay, do I like this? Do I not like this? Is this good? Is this bad? And what they do is they kind of glance out of the corner of their eye, and there's one person in the room that they look to see if they're like, okay, yeah, I like that. If they're engaged, or if they're like, whatever, and then they take their cue on how to respond based on that person. It's that person that's actually the leader in the room, instead of the person up there with the agenda and the new idea. And so that's really what goes on. And the leaders often are behind the scenes, and then they emerge when something unusual happens, like the announcement of a new bonus program. And those are the kinds of things that I find interesting and I like to watch. So what are the characteristics? What are the things that the people who are leaders do versus the things that managers do? And most of the time, the leader is the person who knows the people better. They're a little bit more personal. They know a little bit more about the individual stories and backgrounds. Not that they're like over the top and like in their business or anything like that, but they just generally tend to be more attentive and alert to just the life of the environment that's going on in the people's lives in their environment. And they're attuned to that. They understand this is a good time to speak. This is not a good time to speak. This is the kind of tone I should take versus with this person versus that person. And that's really what we're talking about. It's subtle differences, but there's significant differences.
Yeah, you bring up obviously a lot of good points there. It's almost like you've written a book on this. But as you're kind of talking through that, what it makes me think about is a couple things. Number one is, when I see in businesses struggle, a lot of the times it's because someone has taken an employee that has been there for a very long time, and they need to promote them somewhere. So they make that person a leader of a department. Yeah. And they expect them to lead that department well when that person is not suited for it. They may be a good manager, definitely not a good leader. Right. And I think, as you kind of explain it, it's, the CEO is looking at this person saying, hey, why are you being a bad manager? Because I'm expecting you to be a leader, not a manager. And I think that there's a lot of confusion around that because they use those words probably too interchangeably. The second thing I'm thinking in line with this is, does the hierarchy need to exist in every department? So, for example, can you have a really good manager who manages the team, but also have a leader within that department who can help lead and be that, thought maker, or whatever you want to call that person? There's probably a better word for that. Thought leader might be the word, but how does that dynamic work?
Yeah. So, going back to one of your earlier points is, yes, people get promoted beyond their level of competence. That's a very common phenomenon in organizations, is because we don't know how to assess leadership well. We assess the performance. We say, hey, since you're a good salesperson, you must be a great manager or leader. So we have to promote you. And then this goes back to the whole seniority mindset that is also pervasive in our culture, is the idea that seniority is what warrants rewards as opposed to leadership behavior. So yeah, you're exactly right with that. And then you're right, is because people get promoted to these manager positions and they're expected to lead, but they don't have the skill sets to lead. Because even think about the training programs that we have. The leadership training programs we have aren't leadership training programs. They're management training programs. And we do an incredible disservice to the people on our teams and departments when we mislabel things like that. And so they're expected to lead, they're expected to inspire, to motivate, to be empathetic, to understand, to draw out people's inner performer, kind of thing. And that's what a leader does. But managers don't do that. Managers set agendas, they set quotas, they schedule meetings, they organize stuff, and they're very organized, they're very systematic. They make sure people are performing. In fact, in the early 1900s, they used to call it scientific management, and it was management by objective was another thing that they kind of used. And basically, they just sat down and they just established milestones or markers, and then they just did whatever they could do, either coercively, punitively, or incentive-wise to get people to meet these milestones. So there was no leadership needed. It was either I'm going to punish you if you don't meet this quota or milestone, or I'm going to reward you if you do. And when you live that way, it's called transactional leadership. We have a contract. You agree to give me 40 hours a week or whatever in return for this outcome. And if you meet it, great, here's your paycheck, here's your bonuses. If you don't, sorry, you don't get paid or you get fired or whatever it is. And that's very transactional. And we called that leadership for so long. And we're starting to realize now, especially in the age of what's called the knowledge worker, where most of the time the employee knows as much or more than the manager and leadership in charge. Which is a unique thing that's started around the 1980s, but has become incredibly prevalent now. And then also with the knowledge available to employees and the internet and remote work and all the stuff, it's totally turned leadership on its head. The biggest thing, though, that's turned leadership on its head is this concept called VUCA, V-U-C-A, and it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the VUCA world, especially post-COVID, it was there before COVID, it was used a lot, but the post-COVID really accelerated that and really magnified the concept of VUCA, which is basically the environment that we're in now is volatile, means it's always changing. We don't know what's going to happen when. It's uncertain, which means the predictability that we used to have is completely gone. It's complex, meaning there's usually several variables that are influencing the outcome instead of one or two variables. And then it's ambiguous, which simply means there's more than one right answer. And so with that reality, it dramatically, and I don't just mean dramatically, I mean dramatically changes leadership, because you can't lead in a VUCA world the same way you lead in a stable, reliable world. So not only do we need to move away from transactional models, but we need a completely different mindset when it comes to leadership, because things are constantly changing. They're incredibly complex. And to lead in those environments requires thinking completely differently about the situation I'm involved in. So you can't be transactional. You have to get to know the people, treating everyone the same, which is the old HR moniker of, fairness and equity and all that. It's a great idea, but it doesn't work. And the data and the research and the literature is overwhelmingly conclusive on the fact that it doesn't work. We need to be flexible. We need to be open-minded. We need to have all these skill sets that managers just aren't equipped for, because they're just like, here's what we need to get to. And the only motivation or the only power that I have is to reward you financially or withhold finances from you. And that just doesn't work anymore, because people aren't even as motivated by that as they used to be, which is evident with the gig economy and how frequently and how often people are just checking out. We blame it on the younger generation. It's not the younger generation. It's everybody who are like, you know what? I don't need this. I'm just going to do gig work. I'm just going to moonlight on the side, do my own things, and I'll just take jobs as I can get them and create my own little niche organization. I'll work for myself. It's happening everywhere. And I believe partly due to, yes, the VUCA environment, but a big part of that is the fact that we have so mishandled the difference between management and leadership that I think it's contributing to that.
So what I'm hearing you say there is, it's a combination of a couple things. One is that we have not done a good enough job of understanding the difference between a manager and a leader.
Correct.
And now two, because of this change in VUCA, which has basically sped up the need for better leaders, now that's exacerbating the problem and making it even more apparent when you have a manager who isn't set out to lead.
Right.
Do I hear that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So is there a good way that you found where a CEO or, the top dog can evaluate their team to figure out, is this person suited for management or leadership? Because, like you said before, hey, this guy's our top salesperson. He's been here for 20 years. Let's put him in charge of the sales department. And then when your sales department's sales start declining, you blame that guy. You see it all the time. Like, what is a CEO supposed to do in that scenario? How do they adequately judge whether this person is suited to be a manager, be a leader, or should they just stay as the top salesperson and be neither one?
Yeah. So great question. So I'll answer it two ways. First, I think that last thing you just said, should they just remain the top salesperson, is actually a much more viable solution than people realize, because a lot of times we need to, or the manager or the CEO needs to recognize this is the top salesman. So what do they know to do? Well, we'll just promote them. That's the only way I know to give them more money. And they step out of the role that they were successful in the first place. So that's pretty tough. So, yeah, I think it's a big option to sit and say, do you actually want to stay the top salesman? Do you want to stay? Would you like the stress and pressure of leadership? In my own situation, I've been in higher ed now for 30 years, 28 years. I've been asked multiple times to be the dean, so to speak. And I'm just like, absolutely not. It would kill me. Yes, it's more money. Yes, all the stuff, more prestige, so to speak. But I don't want to be the dean. That would just suck the life out of me. I don't want to do that. I love the classroom. I love interacting with students. I love the exploratory nature of the work that I do, and to have to run meetings and manage and solve problems and I was like, no way, that would kill me. So I think that's a big option. The other part to your question was, well, what are the tools that you can use to assess, should this person be promoted? Should I put them there? And it's really a good segue into some of the work that I do. I mentioned Contextual Intelligence. As a book that I wrote, actually the second edition, believe it or not, came out like 2 days ago. And so I'm really excited about that. But within the context of contextual intelligence, I developed a framework called 3D thinking. 3D thinking is an assessment that I've developed based on certain behaviors that leaders need to do to be successful. And those behaviors are integrate hindsight, insight, and foresight simultaneously. Right. So I'm opening up a new Pandora box here for us. But basically what we've learned is the leaders who lead well actually do something different than most other people do. And that's they have a 3-dimensional quality to their thought life, to their mindset. The 3 Ds I'm talking about are the 3 dimensions of time. So that's where 3D comes in, past, present, future, the 3 dimensions of time. Within the contextual intelligence framework, we call it hindsight, insight, and foresight. And there's instruments out there, mine one of them, on how it's a 48-item test. You just take to answer 48 questions, and each of those 48 questions has a specific tie to a particular time orientation. And what we can do, we can assess if someone is a hindsight dominant thinker, a foresight dominant thinker, or an insight dominant thinker. So a hindsight dominant thinker is someone who focuses excessively on the past, what happened last time. Okay, this is very managerial. Managers do this a lot. They're like, what happened last time? We're going to try it again this time. This didn't work last time. We're not going to do it again. We're not going to try it this time. And they're always using the past as their go-to frame of reference for how to evaluate whatever's going on right now. That's hindsight. Insight is someone who is very astute and aware of the current factors right now, real time, what's happening today. It doesn't matter what we did last time. This is what's happening today, and maybe it's different than last time. So they're overly focused on right here, right now, and they forget the past and they don't think about the future. The foresight dominant person, which is a lot of leaders, especially CEOs, C-suite people, tend to be foresight dominant. They see a future that other people can't see. They see the future that other people don't see, and they're really good at articulating that. They can explain, this is where we need to be, this is how we need to get there, and they're all that, right? And those all 3 of those things are great things, but they only really work when you do all 3 of them. Again, most people are dominant in one or the other. So the instrument that I developed, it's called the Contextual Intelligence Profile, actually assesses what's your dominant one, what's your weakest one, how can we, and then there's behaviors associated with each of those 3 time orientations. So now we can take a team, take an individual, and help them become all 3. And that's really, and then there are those individuals who score great on all 3. And those are the people who tend to actually excel and do really well with leading and managing, because they understand where they came from, the history, they understand where they want to go, and they know how to get there. And then they're also aware of the current environments right now that are affecting both how we see the past and how we are going to get to the future. So those are the people who really are the ones who excel in those environments. So that would be one way to assess that.
And I think those people are the unicorns, right? They exist, but there are few and far between.
Correct. The beautiful thing about this, though, and you're absolutely right, they are unicorns. But the beautiful thing about it is it's now I shouldn't say it's easy to learn, but it's learnable. And you can learn these things with the proper dedication and proper time. So it's been shown tons and tons of times, not only in my own research, but many other people's research, these skill sets can be learned, and which is the great part.
Right. I think it goes back to personal decisions, right? So if you look back at sort of your decision, hey, do I want to be the dean or not? I think society tells us we want to chase more money. We want to chase more prestige, right? That's a bigger title. People will think you're more important. And I think a lot of people fall into that trap and then later get frustrated when they realize, hey, I don't get the ability to do the thing I'm passionate about. I'm not connected to the students anymore. Now I'm just in meetings with other people. I'm not able to have the flexibility to go travel and do the things that I want to do that make me happy. And, you know, I think it's an interesting thing a lot of people don't realize until it's too late. We're prioritizing the wrong things in this and then getting frustrated when that person isn't performing at their best. Right. So what are your thoughts on that aspect of it? And beyond just the technical skill set of someone who is, you know, either a foresight dominant thinker or whatever, but like, where does it relate back to the joy of being present in the life that you've built rather than just chasing, you know, whatever society tells you you're supposed to be?
Right. So, Jim, that's an incredibly insightful question, because I think you touched on something very important there. It's society tells us to, you know, always, you know, go for the brass ring, so to speak, you know, always take an opportunity when you get it. And I think that's an incredibly unfortunate situation to find yourself in. In my situation, it's you have to know your limitations. You have to know what makes you happy. And one of the other things that I have a strong interest in studying and learning about in these other aspects, the human behavior side, so many people don't know or can't articulate what truly makes them happy. They actually think more will make them happy. And the evidence is overwhelming that when they get more, they become the dean, for example, then all of a sudden they realize, I hate my job. This is so frustrating. I don't want to go to work today, you know, kind of a thing. And boy, I wish I could get out of this and go back. And that's just a lesson I learned young, whether I learned it from my dad or not, my parents. I don't know. I don't know where I picked that up, but I never wanted to get promoted beyond my competency. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's just incredible self-awareness. I'd like to think it's self-awareness, but maybe it's not. Maybe it is fear of failure. I don't know. But I think there's some truth to the fact that most people still don't recognize what truly makes them happy. I remember, you know, when my sons were younger, they're grown and married and, you know, all that now themselves. But I remember explaining to them early on that I actually took two of the best decisions I've made in my career were jobs that I took less money so that I could be home more or I could be around more. And I remember making those decisions because, well, no, the quality of my life is based on the time I can spend with my family, my kids, things like that. And if I take this job, that's going to take me away from this. But if I take this other job, it's going to free up more time for me to do this. And yeah, it's $2,000 less a year, but in the grand scheme of it, $2,000 a year is like $20 on a paycheck, you know? So it's like, it's a no brainer. And I think a lot of people don't think that way. And I think a big part of the question that you're asking is people need to be, and I don't know how to do this, but I do think people need to be more self-aware as to when they're in their sweet spot versus when they're not in their sweet spot and what it would take to get them there. So self-awareness is a big part of that. Willingness to be content. I mean, there's a novel concept for you. Do I need more? You know, and I know, and there's been actually tons of research on this. There's a certain threshold. For your listeners, don't quote me on this number because I'm just pulling out from raw memory. So I could be wrong, but I do believe the number is $66,000. And what that means is, yes, your quality of life dramatically improves. Let's say if you go from making $40K a year to $60K a year, right? And you're going to say, hey, that extra 20 grand a year is life-changing money for us right now. That's a big difference. Okay. Yes. But actually, I think it's, like I said, I think it's 66,000, but going from 66,000 to 76,000 doesn't really make that big of a difference in the quality of your life every day, because you usually have enough. Now, again, that's probably a number from the 80s, because that's probably when the research was done. So I imagine the number is a little bit different now, but my point isn't the number. My point is there's a threshold that once I reach a certain threshold of income, more doesn't mean better. And it just means more stress, more time, loss of the things that I really do like. Everybody needs to figure out what that is for them, because I would imagine it's kind of different for every person. And most people aren't aware of that. And I think that was something that I learned early on, because I do remember actually reading that research like in undergrad or something, for some paper I was writing or something like that. And that actually stuck with me. And I remember thinking, okay, this few $1,000s more a year for this other job isn't going to change what we do every day. Now, like I said, if somebody offered me 50 grand more a year, okay, that's different. But these few $1,000s, and I think people are chasing the few $1,000s, and they get in these jobs that they don't like for just a few more dollars. And it's really frustrating. That's why I think personally, so many people are frustrated with their lives the way that it's being played out.
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of it, from my perspective, has to do with sense of self, your authenticity, how close you're operating in that. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know who they are, right, at the truest form. And they attach a lot of the, social, the societal pressure to that. So if you're not comfortable with who you are, like you yourself in a room, nobody else, you're happy in your own life, you don't necessarily care what your neighbor thinks about
right.
it. But if you're not really sure who you are and you're relying on other people's opinions, you're going to let them dictate whether or not you take that job.
Yeah.
Right. So I think if you're happy with who you are, if you're happy in your life, you're not worried about the criticism or the judgment from anybody else, you're really happy to say, hey, yeah, I'll take the job at Walmart stocking shelves rather than being the store manager.
Right.
Because I understand, hey, if I'm stocking the shelves, I have enough to pay my bills. I have enough free time to be able to spend with my family. Right. Whereas if I take the manager job, society's going to say like, oh, cool, you're the manager of the store. It sounds better on your LinkedIn profile than I'm just the guy who stocks the shelves. Right. But that dude's not spending the same amount of time with his family. That dude's stressed to the max. He's not enjoying his life. And obviously there are some people who do it well. If you're suited for that, cool, go do it. But I think a big part of it has to do with finding out who you are authentically and then living in that, not worrying about, hey, am I a manager or a leader, or am I just the guy who stocks the shelves or cooks the fries? If you're genuinely happy and living your best life, who cares?
Right. And, so you bring up a couple of interesting points there too, because the first thing that I think about is the problem that we're just describing is generally a boomer and an Xer problem. You find that millennials and the zennials and even the alphas now, which are the teenagers and lower, 12 years old and lower, they're not having these problems. And it's the zennials, for example, the Gen Z, that are taking these gig jobs and doing these things because they don't have the hangups that the boomers and the Xers do. I need a title for self-satisfaction. We put our identity comes from the work we do. And that's a big reason for why we're describing the problem that we're describing. We're seeing actually it's pretty clear the younger generation, and I'm thinking, the 30-year-olds and younger, really don't have that problem anymore. They're totally happy. They actually, some interesting research about, we've all remember studying in school Maslow's hierarchy, right? And at the very top is self-actualization. But before that, you've got to have, the physiological needs, social needs, and all the way up. And we being, I'm a Gen Xer, the baby boomers, they are very much, all about Maslow's hierarchy. The Zennials have actually done it's called the Maslow flip. They've actually turned Maslow's hierarchy upside down. They're actually foregoing good paying jobs, security, tenure, these long-term jobs for self-actualization. They're turning down jobs. It's like, no, I'd rather keep my gig work. I'd rather take a year or two and just do these odd jobs because I want to travel. I want to find out who I am. I'm not going to take a job that I don't find personally fulfilling and meaningful. Whereas my generation, I'm taking the job because it offers me 10 grand more a year, whether it's meaningful or not. The younger generation is very much all about, I need to have meaning in my work. They're quitting jobs, good jobs, because they don't like the social stance of the organization. Or because they're not contributing enough to whatever they're interested in, stuff like that. So it's beginning to change with the younger generation. But I want to go back to even our earlier conversation, because how do guys like myself, like you, other people get to the place where we can recognize what truly makes us happy? And I believe this with all my heart, and it's travel. And going back to the opportunities where when you can go around, and I've lived in Africa, I've lived in Australia, I spent a lot of time in Peru, and I've been to other developed countries like Australia, and I've been to developing countries like Peru and Rwanda. And, you live in spaces like that. You go to China, I spend a lot of time in China, and you realize what really matters when you do that. Because you live, for example, at my time in Rwanda, I had a guy drove me every day, just a regular taxi guy. It was his livelihood. So he ended up wanting to pick me up every day so he could have consistent work. So he did. So my taxi driver, his name was Thaddy. Great man. Spoke 7 languages. He's a taxi driver, wow. Kind of a thing. And you would think, hey, Thaddy, you're a smart guy. I mean, don't you want to do something else? You could work for the government. You could work for one of these organizations. I mean, kind of a thing. But he's like, why would I want to do that? I could do what I want, when I want, go where I want. I can work when I want. You don't have to work. I just drive a cab. And he loved it, and he was happy, and we talked every day for 6 months, and an incredible conversationalist. And like I said, I learned stuff from my cab driver more than I learned from my colleagues at the university, kind of a thing. And I think it's travel. And then maybe that's why, go back to your first question, maybe that's why I like travel so much, is because you get to experience the kinds of things that really draw out the value and quality of life. One of the things that I was very intentional to do is all that traveling that I did with my family. So we actually homeschooled our kids early on because we were doing all the traveling. And so my kids have grown up and lived in Australia. They lived in Rwanda. They've been all around the world, different places with me. And when I actually go speak at venues or go to an international conference or something, I would take one of my boys with me, and we just alternated, whose turn is it kind of a thing. And they have that same awareness. And I think travel is a big, big part of that, because you actually learn what you need, what you don't need when you travel to those types of places.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for that perspective, which I think is ultimately what it is, right? It's perspective on life, on what's important, on how other people live, how other people value things. And I think the other big part of that too is conversation.
Yeah.
Because there's probably a lot to be learned from just talking to the people around you in your community.
Imagine that.
We often overlook. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great segue for this statement, is that I've learned a lot from our conversation here, and I appreciate the perspective that you've shared with me. As we kind of draw to a close here, is there anything else that you'd love to add, or some kind of final words that you think people should pursue?
Yeah. So I'll say this. I just wrote a new book. It's coming out, and it actually has a lot to do with what we're talking about. The title of the new book is Becoming Epic. And then epic is a mnemonic for be excellent, be perceptive, be inspired, and be compassionate. And the subtitle is A Remedy for Mediocrity. And so I think that's coming out in August. You can find it on my website, which is matthewkutz.com. Kutz is spelled Kutz. And I think a lot of what we've talked about is the epic mindset and how we need to adjust our perspective in order to see the world as we need to see it to be truly happy and content and not settle for mediocrity.
Good. I love that. Well, I'll be sure to pick a copy of that up because I am intrigued. But we'll also make sure we link all of this in our show notes as well for everyone listening. Again, thank you. It's been a tremendous conversation, and I truly appreciate all you've offered.
Thanks, Jim.